The jungle was quiet in a way that made men uneasy. It was early 1942. Somewhere in the Pacific, the humidity hung heavy in the air, pressing against uniforms already soaked through with sweat. American infantrymen moved cautiously along a narrow trail cut through dense foliage, every step measured, every sound suspicious. They had been warned about Japanese armor. Intelligence briefings had spoken of enemy tanks operating alongside infantry, steel machines capable of crushing defensive positions and breaking morale. Then the sound came. A low mechanical rattle, uneven and metallic, echoing faintly through the trees. The men froze. Rifles tightened in their hands. For many of them, this was the first time they were about to face an enemy tank in combat. In Europe, tanks were monsters' thick armor, heavy guns, engines that dominated the battlefield. The assumption was simple. Steel meant danger. The vehicle emerged slowly from the green wall ahead. Its silhouette was smaller than expected, its movement awkward. As it pushed forward, branches snapped against its hull, and mud clung to its tracks. The Americans waited for the blast they expected to follow. It never came. What stood before them looked like a tank, but in those few silent seconds, something felt wrong. And as the first shots were fired, U.S. soldiers would realize that this machine, feared in briefings and rumors, was nothing like the armored threat they had imagined. That realization would change how the Pacific War was fought. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did so with a set of assumptions shaped largely by European experience. For more than 2 years, American military observers had watched armored warfare unfold across Poland, France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Tanks there were decisive instruments. They shattered defensive lines, absorbed punishment, and dictated the tempo of entire campaigns. Armor meant power. Armor meant inevitability. Those assumptions traveled with American troops across the Pacific. Before the first landings, U.S. intelligence reports painted an incomplete picture of Japanese armored capability. Japanese forces had used tanks in China since the 1930s, often with success against poorly equipped opponents. Western observers knew the names of certain models, knew that Japan possessed armored units, and assumed that, like every other major power, those units were improving rapidly under wartime pressure. Few questioned whether Japanese tanks were built for the same kind of war Americans expected to fight. In late 1941 and early 1942, American units were rushed into unfamiliar terrain with limited preparation. The Pacific was not Europe. There were no wide plains for maneuver, no long sight lines, no paved road networks designed for heavy vehicles. Instead, there were jungles, volcanic rock, swampy lowlands, and narrow coastal strips where movement was slow and visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Yet, U.S. planning still imagined armored threats behaving in familiar ways. Early clashes reinforced these fears. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia, capturing territory at a speed that shocked Allied commanders. Infantry assaults were disciplined and aggressive. Artillery was well coordinated. The psychological effect of Japanese momentum created the impression of technological parity, even superiority, across all branches. Tanks, by association, were assumed to be part of this larger machine. American soldiers arriving in the Pacific carried that belief with them. Most had never seen a tank up close outside of training films or parade demonstrations. Those films emphasized armor thickness, firepower, and the danger posed to exposed infantry. Anti-tank training for U.S. troops was still evolving, and in the early months of the war, many frontline units lacked sufficient specialized weapons. A tank encounter was something to be avoided, not tested. At the same time, Japanese doctrine placed armor in a very different role than Western armies did. Tanks were not intended to spearhead deep breakthroughs or engage in prolonged duels with enemy armor. They were support weapons, designed to assist infantry attacks, clear obstacles, and exploit weak points once resistance began to collapse. This distinction, however, was not yet understood by the Americans facing them. As U.S. forces dug in on islands and jungle positions, the fear of Japanese tanks loomed larger than their actual numbers. Reports circulated through units. often exaggerated by repetition. A single armored sighting could grow into rumors of entire formations. Inexperienced troops imagined steel beasts emerging from the foliage, impervious to rifle fire and unstoppable once committed. But those fears were built on distance and assumption. They had not yet been tested by direct contact. That test was coming when American infantry would finally see, hear, and strike a Japanese tank at close range, and discover how different reality was from expectation. Japanese armored doctrine had been shaped long before the Pacific War began. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did so with a set of assumptions shaped largely by European experience. For more than 2 years, American military observers had watched armored warfare unfold across Poland, France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Tanks there were decisive instruments. They shattered defensive lines, absorbed punishment, and dictated the tempo of entire campaigns. Armor meant power. Armor meant inevitability. Those assumptions traveled with American troops across the Pacific. Before the first landings, U.S. intelligence reports painted an incomplete picture of Japanese armored capability. Japanese forces had used tanks in China since the 1930s, often with success against poorly equipped opponents. Western observers knew the names of certain models, knew that Japan possessed armored units, and assumed that, like every other major power, those units were improving rapidly under wartime pressure. Few questioned whether Japanese tanks were built for the same kind of war Americans expected to fight. In late 1941 and early 1942, American units were rushed into unfamiliar terrain with limited preparation. The Pacific was not Europe. There were no wide plains for maneuver, no long sight lines, no paved road networks designed for heavy vehicles. Instead, there were jungles, volcanic rock, swampy lowlands, and narrow coastal strips where movement was slow and visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Yet, U.S. planning still imagined armored threats behaving in familiar ways. Early clashes reinforced these fears. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia, capturing territory at a speed that shocked Allied commanders. Infantry assaults were disciplined and aggressive. Artillery was well coordinated. The psychological effect of Japanese momentum created the impression of technological parity, even superiority, across all branches. Tanks, by association, were assumed to be part of this larger machine. American soldiers arriving in the Pacific carried that belief with them. Most had never seen a tank up close outside of training films or parade demonstrations. Those films emphasized armor thickness, firepower, and the danger posed to exposed infantry. Anti-tank training for U.S. troops was still evolving, and in the early months of the war, many frontline units lacked sufficient specialized weapons. A tank encounter was something to be avoided, not tested. At the same time, Japanese doctrine placed armor in a very different role than Western armies did. Tanks were not intended to spearhead deep breakthroughs or engage in prolonged duels with enemy armor. They were support weapons, designed to assist infantry attacks, clear obstacles, and exploit weak points once resistance began to collapse. This distinction, however, was not yet understood by the Americans facing them. As U.S. forces dug in on islands and jungle positions, the fear of Japanese tanks loomed larger than their actual numbers. Reports circulated through units, often exaggerated by repetition. A single armored sighting could grow into rumors of entire formations. Inexperienced troops imagined steel beasts emerging from the foliage, impervious to rifle fire and unstoppable once committed. But those fears were built on distance and assumption. They had not yet been tested by direct contact. That test was coming when American infantry would finally see, hear, and strike a Japanese tank at close range, and discover how different reality was from expectation. Japanese armored doctrine had been shaped long before the Pacific War began. On paper, a tank represented dominance. On the battlefield, the Japanese tank often found itself confined by the very environment it was meant to master. Jungle terrain, limited speed and maneuverability, forcing armored vehicles onto predictable paths. Narrow trails, soft ground, and dense vegetation meant tanks advanced slowly, often in single file, with little room to react. For American infantry, this changed everything. A slow-moving tank was a vulnerable tank. U.S. soldiers learned quickly that Japanese armor rarely operated with the layered support seen in European theaters. There were no screens of accompanying tanks, no overlapping fields of armored fire. A single vehicle might advance with infantry nearby, but separation was common in chaotic jungle fighting. Once isolated, the tank's weaknesses became obvious. Its thin armor could be penetrated or cracked by weapons already in the infantry arsenal. Anti-tank rifles, rifle grenades, and ebb and well-placed explosive charges proved effective. Tracks were exposed. Vision slits were narrow. Engines overheated under sustained fire. Engagements became close, personal, and brutal. Instead of long-range duels, American troops fought tanks at distances measured in feet. Fear gave way to calculation. Where could it be hit? How fast could it turn? How many seconds before it stalled or stopped moving altogether? These were not the questions soldiers expected to be asking of a tank, but they were the questions that decided the outcome. Japanese tank technology reflected a philosophy of sufficiency rather than superiority. Armor thickness was minimal. Welding quality was inconsistent. Internal layouts prioritized crew efficiency over protection. Ammunition storage was exposed. Fuel tanks were vulnerable to ignition. By contrast, American weapons were evolving rapidly. Even early war anti-tank measures, though limited, were more than adequate against Japanese designs. When heavier equipment became available, the imbalance grew worse. What had once required courage and improvisation began to require only correct procedure. American soldiers were surprised not just by how easily Japanese tanks could be stopped, but by how little damage was required to disable them. A single penetrating hit could cripple mobility, kill crew members, or ignite. The margin for error inside the tank was small. This technological gap was not immediately apparent from silhouettes or intelligence summaries. It revealed itself only under fire, when steel met steel and one side consistently failed to absorb the punishment expected of it. The realization unsettled early assumptions and forced both sides to confront the limits of their designs. For American soldiers, the first successful engagement against a Japanese tank was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological turning point. Fear had dominated earlier expectations. Tanks were supposed to be invincible, machines that demanded withdrawal or overwhelming firepower. When that illusion shattered, it left behind something far more dangerous to the enemy: confidence. Men who had once frozen at the sound of approaching armor began to move toward it instead of away from it. They learned to watch for exhaust smoke, to aim for tracks, to exploit blind spots. Tank encounters became drills rather than disasters. Each destroyed vehicle reinforced the lesson that steel alone did not decide battles. For Japanese crews, the experience was very different. They entered combat believing their tanks were adequate for the role assigned to them. When those tanks failed under unexpectedly light fire, the shock was immediate and personal. Crews were exposed inside cramped hulls with limited escape options. Casualties were high. Survivors reported feeling trapped rather than protected. The battlefield punished misplaced faith harshly. Courage could not compensate for thin armor. Japanese armored doctrine placed tanks in support of infantry, not as independent weapons. This worked in China, where opponents lacked effective anti-tank weapons. Against American forces, the same approach proved inadequate. Tanks advancing alongside infantry became priority targets, and once disabled, they blocked movement rather than enabling it. Japanese commanders were slow to adapt. Industrial constraints limited the development of heavier tanks, and doctrinal rigidity discouraged radical change. Instead of redesigning armor, leadership often emphasized greater infantry sacrifice to compensate for material weakness. Tanks were committed despite their vulnerability, sometimes in frontal assaults that achieved little beyond additional losses. American leadership, by contrast, adapted quickly. Once the weakness of Japanese armor was understood, training and tactics shifted. Infantry were encouraged to engage tanks aggressively. Anti-tank weapons were prioritized for forward units. What began as improvisation hardened into doctrine. The imbalance widened with each engagement. Japan had underestimated its opponent's adaptability. American forces learned fast. shared lessons rapidly, and adjusted equipment and tactics accordingly. The myth of Japanese armored strength did not survive repeated contact with reality. This miscalculation carried consequences far beyond individual battles. Tanks that could not dominate the battlefield became liabilities. Their presence no longer intimidated. Instead, it drew fire. That shift set the stage for a decisive confrontation, one where expectation and reality would collide in full view, marking the turning point in how Japanese armor was perceived and employed. The decisive moment did not arrive in a single, dramatic clash. It came in fragments and beaches, along jungle trails, and inside hastily dug defensive lines where American infantry finally confronted Japanese tanks under conditions that stripped away every illusion. By mid-1942, U.S. forces were no longer reacting blindly. They had learned what Japanese armor could and could not do. On islands where terrain forced attackers and defenders into close contact, tanks became unavoidable when Japanese commanders committed armor. It was often in support of infantry counterattacks meant to regain lost ground or break American footholds. One such engagement unfolded at close range, in dense vegetation where visibility was limited and movement slow. A Japanese light tank advanced along a narrow track, its engine audible long before it appeared. Infantry followed behind it, using the vehicle as mobile cover. The intent was clear: push forward, disrupt American positions, and exploit confusion. This time, there was no panic. American soldiers held their positions. Anti-tank teams moved into place. Rifles, machine guns, and grenades were ready. As the tank emerged, it fired sporadically, its main gun lacking the explosive force to neutralize well-prepared defenses. The vehicle's armor absorbed the first impacts, but it did not take long for cracks to appear. A concentrated burst of fire struck the vision ports. Another hit damaged a track. The tank slowed, then lurched to one side. Grenades followed, targeting the rear where the engine and fuel systems were most exposed. Smoke began to pour from the hull. The Japanese infantry stalled. Without the tank's momentum, their advance faltered. American fire intensified. Within minutes, the armored spearhead of the attack was immobilized. Still intact in appearance, but functionally defeated. Similar scenes played out across the theater. In the Philippines, on Guadalcanal, and in later island campaigns, Japanese tanks were engaged at distances so close that individual soldiers could identify weak points by sight. What should have been decisive assets became liabilities, drawing attention and fire rather than shielding advancing troops. The turning point was not just the destruction of tanks. It was the realization that they could be destroyed with resources already at hand. Fear evaporated under repetition. Each disabled vehicle reinforced a growing certainty. Japanese armor was not built to survive this kind of war. That certainty would be tested again more violently and more publicly when American forces faced Japanese tanks in larger numbers, and the outcome would leave no doubt about the balance of power. As the campaign tempo increased, Japanese commanders attempted to use their remaining armored forces more decisively. Tanks were committed in coordinated actions, sometimes in groups rather than singly, in the hope that mass and aggression could compensate for technical weakness. These efforts only made the outcome clearer. When multiple Japanese tanks advanced together, their limitations multiplied instead of diminishing. Narrow terrain forced them into predictable formations. Limited radio equipment restricted coordination between vehicles. Once the lead tank was disabled, those behind it were often trapped, unable to maneuver or withdraw under fire. What had been intended as armored thrusts became static targets. American forces responded with calm efficiency. Infantry units no longer waited for orders to engage. Anti-tank teams moved forward instinctively. Machine gun fire suppressed supporting infantry, while explosives and direct fire focused on the vehicles themselves. In some cases, tanks were neutralized before they could fire more than a few rounds. The results were consistent and devastating. Japanese tanks burned. Crews were killed or forced to abandon their vehicles. Survivors reported shock at how quickly their armor failed. Vehicles designed to support infantry instead marked the point where attacks collapsed. These encounters had an immediate effect on battlefield psychology. Japanese tanks ceased to inspire confidence among their own troops. Infantry hesitated to advance behind machines that had repeatedly failed to protect their crews. American soldiers, meanwhile, treated tank sightings not as emergencies, but as tactical problems with known solutions. By late 1942 and into 1943, Japanese armored attacks had lost their offensive value. Tanks were still present, still committed, but no longer decisive. Their destruction became routine rather than remarkable. Reports reflected the shift in tone from surprise to expectation. This was the moment when the balance fully tilted. Japanese armor, once feared in theory, had been exposed in practice. Its weakness was no longer anecdotal. It was established, documented, and understood across the Pacific theater. The fighting would continue, but the lesson was fixed. Japanese tanks could not change the course of the battle. They could only suffer within it. And that understanding would shape everything that followed. The aftermath measured not just in destroyed vehicles, but in altered strategy, morale, and the irreversible decline of Japan's armored presence in the war. The consequences of these encounters were immediate and measurable. After-action reports from American units began to change in tone and detail. Where early documents spoke cautiously about enemy armor, later reports described Japanese tanks as secondary threats, dangerous if ignored, but rarely decisive if confronted directly. Battlefield tallies reflected this shift. Japanese tanks were destroyed in numbers disproportionate to their deployment. Many were knocked out without the use of heavy artillery or air support. Infantry weapons, improvisation, and coordination proved sufficient. In several engagements, American units reported disabling enemy tanks with minimal casualties, a result that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier. This change altered how American commanders planned operations. Defensive positions were no longer abandoned at the first report of approaching armor. Infantry were instructed to hold ground, identify weak points, and engage aggressively. Training manuals were updated. Lessons learned in combat were rapidly circulated across units, ensuring that new arrivals did not repeat old mistakes. For Japanese forces, the losses were harder to absorb. Tanks were not easily replaced. Industrial limitations and shipping constraints meant that every destroyed vehicle represented a permanent reduction in armored capability. Crews, often highly trained, were lost along with their machines. Unlike aircraft or infantry units, armored formations could not be reconstituted quickly. Morale suffered accordingly. Infantry who had once viewed tanks as shields now saw them as magnets for American fire. The psychological role armor was meant to play instilling confidence and momentum collapsed under repeated failure. Tanks became symbols not of strength, but of vulnerability. Japanese field reports acknowledged these problems, though solutions were scarce. Heavier tanks were proposed, but rarely delivered. Modifications offered marginal improvements at best. The fundamental mismatch between design and battlefield reality could not be corrected under wartime conditions. By the time American forces advanced deeper into the Pacific, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese armor had been exposed, neutralized, and largely sidelined. What remained was the broader impact of that exposure on strategy, doctrine, and the course of the war itself. Those longer-term consequences would shape the remainder of the Pacific campaign. As the war progressed, the role of Japanese tanks continued to shrink. They were still present on the battlefield, but increasingly relegated to static defense, limited counterattack, or symbolic resistance, rather than operational necessity. The era in which Japanese armor could influence engagements in a meaningful way had passed. American forces adjusted their approach accordingly. Tanks were no longer treated as priority threats, unless circumstances demanded it. Infantry doctrine emphasized mobility, coordination, and initiative. Confident that Japanese armor could be neutralized when encountered, this allowed U.S. units to focus resources on more dangerous threats, fortified positions, and determined infantry defenses. The strategic imbalance widened as American industrial capacity came fully online. New weapons arrived in quantity. Training improved. Combat experience accumulated across divisions rotating through the theater. Japanese forces, by contrast, faced tightening resource constraints and growing isolation. Their armored units suffered from fuel shortages, spare parts scarcity, and declining crew quality as veterans were lost. Japanese attempts to field improved tanks came too late. and in too small numbers to matter. Designs remained compromised by weight limits, production capacity, and doctrinal hesitation. Even when marginally heavier vehicles appeared, they could not withstand the weapons now standard in American units. The gap that had once been narrow became UNBRE DGEABLE by the later stages of the Pacific War. Japanese tanks were often destroyed before they could influence the battle at all. Air superiority, artillery, and experienced infantry combined to render them irrelevant. Their presence did not alter outcomes. It merely added to casualty lists. In retrospect, the surprise felt by American soldiers early in the war was not that Japanese tanks were weak, but that expectations had been misplaced. Steel alone did not determine battlefield power. Design philosophy, industrial support, and adaptability mattered more. This realization carried lessons beyond the Pacific. It underscored the danger of assuming parity based on appearance, and the importance of understanding an enemy on their own terms, rather than through familiar frameworks. The story of Japanese armor in the Pacific is not one of failure alone. It is a reminder that weapons are shaped by context, and that when context changes, their limitations are revealed without mercy. That understanding leads naturally to reflection on warfare, technology, and the cost of misjudgment. The surprise American soldiers felt when they first confronted Japanese tanks was rooted in expectation, not ignorance. They expected steel to behave the same way it had in Europe. They expected armor to dominate, to intimidate, to endure. What they encountered instead was a machine shaped by different assumptions, fighting a war it was never designed to win. Japanese tanks were not defective in isolation. They were products of geography, industry, and doctrine, built for mobility and support rather than confrontation. They made sense within the narrow framework for which they were intended. But war does not honor intention. It tests weapons against reality. And in the Pacific, that reality was unforgiving. For American forces, the lesson came quickly and at close range. Confidence replaced fear, not because the enemy was weak, but because understanding replaced assumption. Once the myth of armored invulnerability collapsed, the battlefield changed. Initiative shifted. Adaptation accelerated. The outcome followed. For Japan, the cost was irreversible. Armor that could not evolve became a liability. Resources invested too late and too thin could not alter the balance. Crews paid the price for decisions made far from the front. Inside planning rooms, where constraints were accepted as inevitabilities, the broader lesson endures beyond this war. Technology is only as powerful as the doctrine, industry, and adaptability that support it. Appearances deceive. Strength is contextual, and when assumptions go unchallenged, reality eventually corrects them, often with lethal clarity. In the jungles of the Pacific, that correction came in the form of thin steel, shattered expectations, and a realization that reshaped how one side fought and why the other could no longer keep up.